My name is Moon Wolfman Waters, and I'm here to share my experiences with you from the dark side of the world. All of the things you see, but you can't see from underneath the moon. The shadows, the abnormal, the paranormal. These experiences were firsthand from me and my friends, and these are our chronicles from underneath the moon. Welcome in, my friends. Today's story is very scary because it is very real and has previously already happened. So this is history laid out before you. The boy who wanted to be a vampire. From Kentucky, in Kentucky. Now, I do warn you that this story has really happened, and all of the events here have affected people's families, lives, and futures. So if this is something you wish not to hear, I advise you. This is an R-rated story and affects everyone in their own personal way. Rod FERREL was a 16-year-old boy from Murray, Kentucky, whose delusions led him to a ritualistic cult and to brutally murder 14-year-old members' parents in their home. He was the youngest person to be on death row until his sentence was reduced to life in prison with no parole. Roderick didn't have an easy life growing up. He was born to his then 16-year-old mom, Sandra Gibson, on March 28, 1980, in Murray, Kentucky. His father abandoned him to serve in the military and was never part of his life. His maternal grandfather allegedly sexually abused him when he was around 5 years old, according to federal court records. However, no criminal charges were ever pursued. Sandra and Rod did not have a stable home life, bouncing back and forth between living with Sandra's parents and public housing. Sandra worked as an exotic dancer and a sex worker to make ends meet. Sandra introduced Rod to vampires and the macabre from a young age. They bonded over Dracula films and Vampire the Masquerade comic books. Sandra was far from the ideal mother and had a questionable and complex relationship with her son. As Rod himself described, at the age of 34, she was even caught distributing love letters to a 14-year-old boy. I long to be near you for your embrace. Yes, to become a vampire, a part of the immortal, and truly yours forever. I hope that one day you will once again return to Murray. You will then come for me and cross over, and I will be your bride for eternity, and you my sire. Signed, sincerely, Sandra Gibson. Now this sick, disgusting act. No one should ever have to go through that as a child. Now, the rest of the vampire clan's members came from equally depressing and disturbing situations. The most notable member being Scott Anderson, Rod's right-hand man, Chastity Kesey, his then 16-year-old girlfriend, Dana Cooper, and a friend along for the ride. and Heather Windorf, Rod's damsel in distress and victim. All of them took comfort in being able to belong to a group of outsiders and like-minded people, while growing up in a place that is generally unaccepting of anything non-traditional. The gang's meetup spot was called the Vampire Hotel, which was a dilapidated structure in the middle of the woods near Kentucky Lake and the land between the lakes. It was here the clan threw parties, used psychedelic drugs, and took part in various types of rituals and sacrifices. Hearing stories from Heather about suffering abuse at the hands of her father struck a chord with Rod, and after Heather had to move away, Rod became obsessed with the situation and ended up racking up hundreds of dollars in long-distance phone bills for the Windorf family. The final straw for Roderick was when Heather's parents finally cut her off from the phone. And in the 90s, if you were a kid and the only phone you had, because cell phones back then did not exist, was the phone that called through your house and your parents could pick up and decide who you talked to, and you know what this meant. You were never talking to this person again if they didn't approve it as so. The rage had to have fueled Rod. It was then he rallied up his group to go on to the fateful rescue mission, to save Heather from her parents and run away to New Orleans to start their very own vampire family and live happily ever after. Unfortunately, things didn't go according to plan. On November 25th, 1996, Rod and the gang made it 750-mile drive from Murray, Kentucky to Eustis, Florida. After she had been picked up there, the vehicle broke down. Heather made a deal with Rod in which she would use her keys to unlock her home so that her family's vehicle could be stolen, and the clan could complete their trip to New Orleans, excited to start their vampire family, finally alone to begin their own adventure into the world on their dark walk towards being an actual vampire clan. In exchange, Rod agreed to perform the turning ritual, in which she would consume his blood and officially be a vampire and connected to her for forever. Rod would be. The ritual took place early that morning in a Eustis cemetery. Rod consumed a significant amount of LSD before Heather admitted to drinking Roderick's blood from a self-inflicted razor blade wound. The group departed to retrieve the car from Heather's house shortly after. High as a kite, Rod was tripping. Upon arriving at Windorf's residence, Roderick and Scott entered the house through the garage and found Mr. Windorf peacefully resting on the living room couch. After many moments of silence and deliberation, Mr. Windorf awoke to his skull violently being smashed in by Roderick and a crowbar Rod had brought with him in. Mr. Windorf suffered from more than 22 blows to the face, and it's a shame. And nobody should ever have to live through this. Hearing the commotion, Mrs. Windorf entered the living room from the kitchen, horrified at the sight of her husband being beaten to death by random intruders. In an attempt to interrupt this despicable act, she splashed scalding hot coffee into the face of Roderick, who retaliated with a crowbar blow to the face. The blow was so hard, it severed her brainstem, killing her instantly. Rod had once said, "By that time, you know it was pretty obvious. I had blood on me and the crowbar in my hand. I was fixing to say, yeah, I want to have coffee with you, son of a bitch and smartass. But anyways, that's when she lunged at me because I was actually going to let her live. but after she lunged at me, I just took the bottom of the crowbar and kept stabbing it through her skull. And whenever she fell down, I continually beat her until I saw her brains falling on the floor, because that pissed me off. This was Roderick Ferrell's confession regarding the murder of Ruth Wendorf. Afterwards, Roderick and Scott proceeded to ritualistically burn their victims and dance around the bodies as they lay dying on the living room floor. Before leaving, they stole valuables such as jewelry and credit cards before leaving in the family's Ford Explorer. Now you would think that vampires wouldn't need such things because they were undead, but these weren't vampires. These were just children who were lost and knew nothing of the world and had an idea that was brought onto them by movies and everything that was seen on TV and the social culture of vampires that had been growing in the surrounding areas. The bodies would be discovered by Heather's 17-year-old sister, Jennifer. When she returned home from work that night, Heather was unaware of her parents had been murdered until later, assuming everything had gone to plan. Murder warrants were put out for the group of the teens on November 27th. And after 4 days of evading law enforcement, they were finally captured by the police on November 28th, after they tracked a phone call that was made by Chastity when she called her grandparents asking for money. Scott Anderson received 2 life sentences in prison. The amount of his involvement in the murders has come under question, though he claims he never touched Mr. or Mrs. Wendorf. He claimed he attempted and failed to calm a raging Roderick, who proceeded to go crazy and bash their skulls in with a crowbar. At first, Roderick completely denied the accusations, claiming he was being framed by rival vampire gangs. And eventually, with an overwhelming amount of evidence piled against him, he pled guilty. He received 2 charges of first-degree murder, robbery, and burglary, and was sentenced to death. This made him the youngest American to ever be on death row. Scott Anderson received 2 life sentences in prison. The amount of his involvement in the murders has come under question, though claims never he touched a Mr. and Mrs. Wendorf attempted to fall the calm, raging Roderick. Charity Keese and Dana Cooper made plea deals in exchange for reduced sentences. Charity was sentenced for 10 years, released in 2008, and Dana for 17, released in 2015. Scott's sentence was recently changed in 2018 to 40 years, crediting the 22-year-old he has already spent in prison. By the time Scott Anderson is released, in 2032, he'll be 51 years old. In 2000, Roderick Ferrell's death sentence was changed to life in prison after a Florida Supreme Court ruled defendants must be 17 years or older at the time the charges are filed in order to be able to be executed. To this day, Roderick remains in Tomoka Correctional Institute serving out his life sentence. It is truly terrifying what people are capable of. Would Roderick have committed these terrible deeds had he not been subjected to so much trauma and torment? And if he had not been subjected to these scenes of debauchery and vampirism, maybe he would have grown up a normal boy, maybe an angry punk rock young man who liked to play music and use music as his escape. But instead, he murdered innocent people who didn't deserve it. And this vampire gang was very real, and they lived in the land between the lakes, the vampire clan, who murdered somebody's mother and father. My friends, know that we live in a world of paranormal and abnormal, and the reason why I'm bringing this story to you is to show you there's a line. When we cross over a line that we think is ordinary, but it becomes extraordinary and dangerous. That's when you have to open your eyes, look at yourself, sit down and really think, is all of this real? Because the lives that were lost in this story, not only to death, but the years spent in prison for something that could have been avoided if they just would have took into account that this was an exotic lifestyle and none of the things they were doing were real. They were humans, not vampires. They could have saved themselves some fate. So if you know anybody who seems like this, or is living in a fictional world who thinks they're actually a vampire, or a monster, or a werewolf, or a troll, or has demons, it may be time to take them to the hospital, because we need to avoid as much death and disgrace and disgusting actions in this world as we can. The world is dangerous enough as it is, without knowing what's in this world. There could be dark, there could be vampires, there could be dogmen. But the most dangerous and the most irrational killer in this world is the human mind. Stay safe, my friends. Subscribe and become a friend of fear today for more Chronicles from Underneath the Moon.